Welcome to this session on the circular economy. We hope to make this a provocative discussion on what is often thought of as a win-win opportunity for the mining industry, or for that matter, for the world at large. Of course, the circular economy is inspired from natural systems, because natural systems are cyclical. And so there's this sense that if we are able to mimic nature in our industrial processes also, that we will end up in a more sustainable future. However, there will be some provocations along the way, as you'll see through the panel, that as with most phenomena, it's not always as simple as it's made out to be. So I'm not going to spend too much time in the intros and all, because of the short time span that we have. And we will then go directly into first a keynote pitching of the topic from Charissa Rojanovic, who is the Senior Director at Albertsons Companies, focusing on sustainability innovations. And I will request Charissa, as well as other panelists, to introduce themselves as much as they like. In further detail, the bios are online. Just to give you a quick primer on my own interest in this topic, in addition to being an academic, I also serve on the United Nations International Resource Panel. And we have been working in the last 5 years at the IRP, focusing a lot on circularity in material flows and providing science-based policy advice to UN member states. So I'm wearing my UN hat also in the moderator's role in this regard. So over to you then, Charissa.
Yeah, my name is Charissa Rojanovic. I also have had a career in the circular economy and sustainability, and I'm excited today to talk about one of my previous projects, which shares the name LIAM, which this forum is named after. So talking about kind of circular economy with design for recycling. So thank you so much.
So we've got with us Christian Spano. Christian, would you like to give a quick introduction?
Well, Christian Spano, I'm the Director in charge of Innovation at ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals. We represent 30% of the mining market, mining and metals market. 26 CEOs that sit in our council. We represent 650 sites around the world, and we represent the industry, but in a very special way, in the sense that we focus on working with the industry to deliver on critical sustainability aspects, like the SDGs and the targets in the Climate Paris Agreement. I myself, my portfolio looks after climate change, circular economy, tailings, and health and safety. So that's me.
Great. Welcome, Christian. And Hugo, over to you for a quick intro.
Thanks, Saleem. Hi, everyone. Hugo Schumann. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Jetty Resources. Jetty is a breakthrough technology business that has figured out a way to get copper out of what mining companies consider waste rock, which is a low-grade chalcopyrite representing about 70% of the world's remaining copper resources. It's nice to see Ahmad on here, who is actually part of the inventor team that came up with this technology, and it's been a big success. Our shareholders include BHP, Freeport, Teck Resources, BlackRock, Mitsubishi, Orion, and T. Rowe Price, and we're commercially deployed at a few different operations, and have a big growth profile ahead of us. And happy to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugo, and good segue to you, Ahmed.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. Good to see you, Hugo, in this panel as well. Ahmad Ghahraman, CEO and co-founder of Cyclic Materials, which focuses on recycling of rare earth elements and rare earth magnets mostly, another breakthrough company that we are putting together. Strong believer in circular economy and contribution to Jetty Resources. And after that, my contribution to LiCycle, another recycling company that recycles lithium-ion batteries, and now the third company on this source. So basically, strong believer, as I said, in recycling and circular economy and what it takes to build that. hydrometallurgy professor, also formerly at Queen's University, a trained hydrometallurgist, and I will stop there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, with that introductory prelude, I think now we are ready to move on to the presentation. So, I had sent some questions over to the panelists regarding the notion of a circular economy and how the mining industry particularly is approaching it. And essentially, there are two ways in which the mining industry is approaching circularity. One is to focus on operations and see how there can be greater efficiency and circularity within operations. So, for example, water usage, making sure there are more circular flows of water. If you have materials which are in waste currently, extracting useful material out of that waste stream and creating circularity at that level. And that's sort of the area where Ahmed and Hugo are working in with reference to their technologies. So that's one entire scope of circular economy. There is another more kind of macro level scope of a circular economy, which is often put forward by system scientists, and that is that the mining industry should reinvent itself as a material service provider, where basically it's not just about mining, but it's about providing the metal or other minerals, it doesn't matter whether it's being extracted or whether it's coming from a recycled source or whether it is being synthesized in some other form. And that's a more kind of, I would say, transformative approach to looking at how the mining industry might consider circular economy. But it's not something that's completely, out of science fiction. You do have, for example, many companies, like especially in the aluminum industry, which have followed that model of like getting involved in the recycling business. And some of that came out of market determination because aluminum is very energy intensive to process, and especially from bauxite ore. And so there was a natural economic incentive to get more involved in recycling. So a lot of the mining companies with aluminum, they became involved in the recycling business earlier on. However, that has not taken hold with the full scope of the mining industry. So that's another way in which we can talk about circularity. And I hope that the panel will consider both. So maybe what I'll do is, Christian, since you have this panoramic perspective of being at the International Council on Mining and Metals, and you are working with all of the major mining companies in the world, more or less, can you give us a perspective of how ICMM is thinking about circular economy, considering the two aspects that I just presented?
This is fantastic, Saleem, and I have to tell you, this is the first time that I see it put it in that way, Saleem, and that's exactly the way that we are using. I mean, it's great to have a mine that is fully circular. If we fast track 20 years in time, 30 years in time, we can imagine a mine that you cannot see, where the land is not only recovered, but the mine has been designed to increase the productivity of the land. Anything that comes out of the land is circularized, and you bring a number of other industries around to make that mine circular. So there is more employment, there's better productivity, more efficiency, and natural contribution to nature. And that will be like the holy grail in the future. And that's a circular operation, circular process. But still the product that comes out from that mine needs to find the conditions in whatever market it goes to be circular. And here is where I find an interesting blind spot. I would like to get some reactions. We think about materials, and when we think about the circular economy, we draw a circle with a little tail at the end, and we say the holy grail is to have a circle with no tail, basically with no virgin materials coming into the market. And I offer always to people to step back. So if you have a material that is durable, a material that can last forever, actually what you want is to build stocks of that material. You want to build stocks of material that can be used forever. What you don't want is to have material that is not durable, that is unusable, because it becomes waste almost immediately. The best example of this is single-use plastics. Now, it's designed to become waste. But if you have something like steel or aluminum, even battery materials, copper, That's a durable material. So what we should be aiming for is to build stocks that we can use forever. And at that point, we need to ask a different question, which is, what are the conditions that we need to have in place for those materials to be almost renewable? What are the conditions that we need to have in place to be able to recover copper, steel, aluminum at any point in time, not to wait until the end of the life of the product, because then we have massive gaps between virgin supply and recycled material. But what are the conditions that we need to have in place to build stocks of these durable materials, these renewable materials, and be able to recover a large proportion of them efficiently with zero carbon at any point in time? If we think about these stocks, all these metals and minerals are only going to increase in value over time. And the way we're building these stocks in our economies is the old way, which is that we design not for recovery. We design for a life of a product, then it becomes waste, and then we need to use energy to recycle. And so to Saleem's point, there is an element of us stepping back and rethinking the system, and really allowing us to say, what are the conditions that we need to have in place to build a mine above the ground, to build massive mines that are going to receive this stock of copper, steel, aluminum, lithium, cobalt, all of these critical materials that are just going to grow in demand massively in the next 20, 30 years. And be able to understand where these stocks are, track them, recover them at any point in time, understand the value of these stocks, and be able to design for recoverability beyond recycling. So recycling should be an option that we use at the end. If something becomes waste, then we apply the recycling. But otherwise, we should be able to design for recovery at any point in time.
While Christian was talking, I thought of this slide, which is basically, in Life magazine in 1955, they had this as the cover, and it basically was celebrating disposability. So we are coming from this, and this is from the Circular Economy Handbook, which is trying to look at these 4 different aspects of the way in which waste should be realized. So this is a huge paradigm shift within like 5 decades we have had to deal with. So yes, please, over to you, Justin.
All right, everyone. I am sincerely apologies for all the technical difficulties. I will charge through this as quickly as possible. So we can go to the next slide. I think, one of the things Raziel told me on these slides is, to really kind of help the next generation of change makers be inspired on how they can look in their career and in their personal life to make a difference, to make the world a better place. So my career has always been focused on sustainability. That word obviously has really evolved and morphed over time. I think it's somewhat ambiguous at times, but for me, at the beginning of my career, next slide, sustainability was always defined as conservation of resources. And what that really looked like when I graduated college in my early 20s was, next slide, I was actually a conservation biologist for the first 3 to 4 years of my career. So this is a picture of the EEV, which is one of the endangered Hawaiian honey creepers that is left. So the Hawaiian Islands used to have about 54 different individual species of Hawaiian honey creepers, but due to a variety of reasons, such as the accidental introduction of avian malaria or the Polynesian rat, as well as other issues such as climate change and feral pigs, there's only about 17 of these species left. And so while this was a fantastic job in my early 20s, I literally got to chase around endangered bird species in the rainforest. I could tell you where they bred, how many there were, what they actually ate. But at the end of the day, it wasn't really moving the needle in terms of the impact I wanted to have on the natural world and really seeing how can we mitigate impact. And so next slide. As I started kind of doing more reading and getting into this discipline of industrial ecology, which Saleem actually mentioned earlier, I really understood that the root cause of things like endangered species really is human encroachment. And so I became really curious about this idea of what do we produce, how do we consume, how do we actually interact with our resources on Earth, whether they're finite or infinite. And so through kind of this study of industrial ecology, I got super excited about this idea that I could use my learnings from the natural systems. So taking ideas like regeneration, reuse, and recycling that you see in natural systems, and how would we actually apply that to industrial systems. Next slide. So through a series of fortuitous events, I actually ended up at Apple. And in particular, they really wanted me to look at their flagship product. Next page. The iPhone, which when I joined in 2013, they were on the iPhone 5 at the time. But the question that they posed to me joining the environmental team was, what happens to iPhones at end of life? And once they reach end of life, are we pursuing the best in class possible recycling or end of life management, and is there room for improvement? And just for note, I am not an engineer by training. I definitely do not have a background in robotics. My background is literally in chasing birds and biology. But I actually think this was really helpful to enter kind of an engineering space and be able to take my systems thinking, which I learned from ecosystem ecology, being able to work in the field and look at, what are the challenges that we have around the way e-waste is recycled today. Next slide. So as I started going down this path of what actually happens to electronic waste, I definitely figured out that obviously this is not agnostic just to Apple. It's not just an iPhone problem. Again, I think LIAMforum is really catered towards the next generation. I imagine most of you in the audience have a multitude of these products at home, whether it's a GoPro or a drone or a tablet. But truly this challenge that's faced in e-waste recycling today hits across an entire category of products. Next slide. And so the UN, they've actually, a lot of institutes have been putting out a lot of these kind of really astounding data points. And so, every year we produce over 50 million tons of e-waste, and that's valued at about $62 billion every year. So you can imagine this opportunity and kind of the size of the proposition to really invest and invigorate recycling technology and get high value materials out of whole units that have reached their end of life is massive. Next slide. So in 2013, when I started at Apple, the main thing I did for the first, 6 to 9 months, previous slide, was I basically traveled around the world and looked at what best-in-class recycling looks like everywhere. And this is kind of the traditional process. So this is a big e-waste recycling facility in the US. It's pretty similar in Europe and Asia. You can see that it's a whole mix of electronics. Potentially for the younger generation, you might not know what a lot of these things are, but desktop computers, monitors, towers, things like that. They used to be a lot bigger, a lot of plastic, a lot of steel, things like that. But this is kind of the pile of electronics that come in. So you can imagine a tiny little iPhone is also somewhere in there. Next slide. And the basic recycling technology that's used by and large for e-waste recycling today is high volume shredding. So all that material that was in the previous slide, it basically is tossed into what's a car shredder, and it breaks apart these whole units into smaller pieces. The idea behind this being that once you take a whole unit and you break it apart into smaller pieces, it's easier, and I put that in air quotes, to separate and assort by material type. Next slide. But as you can imagine, if you're looking at this shredded material, it actually contains a very high diversity of material, and it's not very easy to sort. So, this high volume shredding was really designed back in the 70s and 80s when electronic devices were much larger and had less materials in them. The modern day consumer electronic today has most of the periodic table in it, and you can see with not just iPhones, but any electronic out there, they're getting smaller, thinner, lighter. So what that really means is you have high dispersion of a very small amount of materials in a whole product. So to me, that didn't really make shredding make sense. So next slide. So if we talk about being able to recycle the highest quality and the highest quantity of materials out of an electronic device, such as some of these key components out of an iPhone, recycling really comes down to being like a matching game. And I'm making this very basic, but the general idea here being like, so we have audio modules in the iPhone that contain rare earth magnets, so things like neodymium, dysprosium. Once that's shredded, that typically goes with the copper fraction. It'll end up at a copper smelter, and because it's not the target material for most copper smelters, it'll end up in slag and then landfill. So again, it's really important that we're taking these materials and being able to disassemble them and then send them directly to the correct material processor so they're not lost and they're not wasted. And so that obviously pivoted me away from high volume shredding. Next slide. And where we ended up was automation. So this was LIAM, announced in 2016. This was the first automated disassembly robot I designed for Apple. And again, not having a background in robotics and mechatronics, I actually think was really helpful because I basically trialed a lot of things that robots don't typically do. We failed a lot. Like I made a lot of terrible mistakes in the machine lab, all under very safe conditions, but I think it was really great to be able to kind of use this think different idea of, what could we actually do to get to our end goal of being able to take out these individual components and then work with iPhone product design to actually send those directly to the material recyclers. Next slide. Yeah, so the automation really allowed us to kind of have this meticulous manufacturing process, or a clean take-apart process, where we're removing each individual component as the whole component, as opposed to shredding it up and then mixing it with all the different materials. Next slide. So we designed some things like, vacuum suction for the removal of screws to keep our workspace clean through the automation process. Next slide. And also custom end-of-arm tooling to actually remove individual components like this rear-facing camera once all the screws have been liberated. Next slide. And so, LIAM really showed us that, we could actually use automation to demanufacture our products, and it allowed us to have higher quality of material recovery because we weren't actually mixing all these materials together, and we could select specific components that were important to us that had high value or high materials of concern, so such as like the rare earth magnets, for example, in audio modules, or tungsten, which is a conflict mineral that's in our Vibe engine, for example. Next slide. So this is a picture of the housings that came out of LIAM. So LIAM only disassembled iPhone 6. iPhone 6 had an Apple spec of a 6063 aluminum alloy. And so from this, what we wanted to try was like, could we actually create a closed loop project? So you can see there's still, there's like some flex material in there, there's stainless steel, things like that. So with a little bit of additional processing, working with the Alloys product design team at Apple, we were actually able to take this as a proof of concept, these iPhone housings that came out of LIAM. And then next slide, some additional processing, we were able to melt them down, maintain that 6063 aluminum alloy spec, and create Mac Minis out of it. So this was just a pilot, just at the proto scale, but this really proved out Apple's first opportunity where we could actually close loop a product. So we had, iPhones that lived their full useful life. They reached true end of life, so they couldn't be reused as a whole unit or component harvesting. We disassembled them with LIAM, collected that material as it was source separated, and then melted it down and made a new Apple product out of it. Next slide. And so in 2017, after the announcement of LIAM, what Apple posed to the industry was, can we actually move to a closed loop supply chain? So can Apple completely stop using materials that we mine from the ground, and can we actually source all of our materials from old end-of-life products, so through recycling or through renewable materials as well? It was a question they posed to the industry, and LIAM was kind of that first standing point. Next slide. So this was actually a movie which now no longer works because I sent it as a PDF, but basically what happens here, for folks who don't know what a circular supply chain looks like, it's just a schematic that really shows this was what a traditional linear supply chain looks like. So we mine materials from the earth, we process them into materials that we can manufacture into products, the customer uses the product, and then unfortunately things like the single-use plastic water bottle that was mentioned earlier to an iPhone, a lot of things end up in landfill. So it becomes linear. That material is trapped in a landfill and we can't use it anymore. Closing the loop, or a circular economy, is closing those two ends so that at end of life, there's a lot of work either in reverse logistics or recycling or reuse, where we can actually take those embedded materials and reuse them again and again in multiple lives. So it's not just a linear output of material. Next slide. So LIAM was fantastic as a prototype, but one of our biggest challenges was that it was completely inflexible in terms of being able to retrofit it for other products. Because again, we were using this clean take-apart process, and even moving from the iPhone 6 to the iPhone 6s, all the screw locations were different, the subcomponents were different. And so if I really wanted to get to the root of what we were trying to design, it was really just material recovery. Because again, these units that are coming back to us, they first are screened whether or not they can be refurbished as a whole iPhone unit. They get screened to see if there's any components that are worth harvesting. But then we get a lot of units that come back that have had significant water damage. They've been run over by a car. I mean, I've seen the whole gamut of what happens to people's iPhones. And so what Daisy is, which is what we call LIAM's older sister, which is this robot here, we designed a system that focuses on destructive disassembly, because we knew that we weren't actually recovering these materials. The key focus of this was actually how can we recover the most materials at the highest quality. So in this picture, what you can see is that we were actually using angled pins to drive in between the cover glass assembly and the housing, as opposed to using the screws and the vacuum suction that we used in LIAM. We didn't need the CGA and the glass to be in pristine condition. Glass is recycled by shredding it anyways. But this allowed us to do 15 different models within a single system. So really trying to meet towards, how does Apple achieve a closed loop supply chain? Well, one of the first steps is having the reverse logistics and the disassembly to recover the most amount of materials at the highest quality from their broadest range of products. Next slide. Another innovation that we had in Daisy is, instead of unscrewing each individual screw, we custom developed a CNC machine where we're actually punching out not just the screw, but the titanium boss that the screw goes into. So you can imagine this actually gave us significantly more flexibility to actually handle a wider range of products, because a lot of products we get back, again, with water damage, we had corroded screws, which Liam had a hard time with. If someone ran over it with their car, the screw locations are not in the same specification from when it was originally manufactured. And so this gave us a higher tolerance to actually remove screws and therefore remove the components from dissimilar units that are coming back from the field. Next slide. So these are the housings. This is a 7000 series aluminum that comes out of Daisy. So you can see all of the components have been removed. And the additional follow-on that we had from learnings that we took from Liam was that we took out the additional kind of contaminants. So the Apple logo, for example, is made out of stainless steel, which is a contaminant to the aluminum recycling process. We punch that out. We actually punch out the camera ring, which is also made of stainless steel. And so this super clean fraction that comes out of Daisy, next slide, can be sent directly to an aluminum smelter. So this becomes a feedstock directly to an aluminum smelter, where we can take this post-consumer recycled content, so these housings that came out of Daisy that had already lived a useful life with a customer, they can be melted back down to post-consumer recycled content aluminum and ready to be used into a new product. Next slide. So I think one of the biggest innovations coming out of Liam and Daisy was that it really helped us change our mindset on what a feedstock is. So obviously this is a mining forum, so I'm not saying that mining shouldn't happen or it's bad or anything like that, but I think it just gives us a paradigm change that this is not the only place where materials have to come from. Next slide. We can actually look at end-of-life electronics as an asset. Like, this is valuable material here. It's not valuable to a customer in that form. Like, clearly that's not going to be a usable iPhone, and there's no recovery method here to actually use the components or the unit itself. But this isn't trash. This isn't waste. This is something that the materials are already there, and from a metallurgical standpoint, it's like a lot of them are already in metal form. The rare earths in there are not rare earth oxides that you have to mine out of the ground. Like, they are actually in magnet form already. And so I think one of the most interesting parts about the Liam and Daisy program was really getting us to think about what constitutes as feedstock, what constitutes as material use. Next slide. So again, one of the interesting stats that Apple was able to publish out of this was, just from 1 metric ton of iPhone components that was removed either by Liam or Daisy, we can actually recover the same amount of gold and copper that would actually be needed to extract out of 2,000 metric tons of mined rock. So again, looking at something like these end-of-life electronics, not as waste, not as something that has no value, but something that has true value, not just to manufacturers, for example, but even to customers and to the environment, right? We're now taking materials out of an urban mined piece of waste that we used to see, and now see it as a new feedstock. Next slide. So I powered through this really quickly, and again, my apologies on the technical difficulties, but I'll just end kind of on one of my favorite quotes that came out of my studies at graduate school on industrial ecology, which is this idea that waste is just a resource displaced. Humans are one of the only species out there that create like true toxic waste, like if you want to talk about like nuclear waste, for example. But this idea that like everything that we create, whether it is that single-use plastic water bottle, which again, the debate on whether or not we should even have that, but all of those things should be seen as a feedstock or as an asset. We should stop using kind of the word waste, because I feel like that allows us to not really think innovatively about what can be done with it. It's just, oh, it's not part of our purview anymore and we're done with it. I really think it's really interesting to start looking at things as waste is just a resource displaced. Let's find a new place where we can improve. So thank you so much. And again, my sincere apologies and all the technical difficulties.
Thank you very much, Arissa, for that really wide-ranging presentation with clear solutions presented. So what I'm going to request with multitasking and time limitation is that if there are questions coming up, because I'm not able to see who else is in the audience, if Justin or Virginia can put them in the chat. And then let's ask, first of all, Hugo to comment on how this kind of an approach that Sharissa has taken, again, going at the big picture level. What are your views as someone who works in the finance operation of a mining company? Do you have some skepticism about having this kind of recycling feedstock working? What are the limitations? When can it work?
That was a fantastic presentation, Carissa. Thank you. And firstly, I think it's really exciting that companies like Apple are setting very strong goals. It's a big consumer brand, and they're setting very clear guidelines of when they're going to be kind of fully circular. And I think that is fantastic. I think that's where the pressure needs to come from. I think we need to think about different types of minerals here, though, because iron ore, for example, how are you going to recycle 1 billion tons of iron ore that's coming out of the ground in Australia when you need to build big structures in China and roads and things like that? And copper, for example, today is 23 million tons of global production coming out of mines, and about 8 million tons or 5 to 8 million tons of recycled. So about 30% is only recyclable now. So there's a long way to go, but I think things like this are very, very important and very exciting. And depending on the type of mineral and the type of process, like if it's iPhones or iPads or electric waste, I think it's a great idea. And I think the business that Ahmed's building in rare earths is going to be very important in that respect, as are companies like Redwood Materials, who are recycling Teslas, for example. So where there are niche applications of doing it, I think it's great, and we need more of it.
Okay, great. Ahmed, so maybe you can comment on the rare earth example. When I visited some of the rare earth mines in China, the people would often tell me, like, the concentration of rare earths in the iPhone is less than in the ore. So how do you think it's going to be workable? So what are the innovations you're working on in this regard?
That actually is true. So in some cases, there is concentration in some of the end-of-life products, such as, I'm not specifically sure of the numbers in Apple iPhones, but in some of the products, the concentration of rare earth elements is lower than the ore. But at the same time, ore is 99.5% of waste and 0.5% of, we have to change that mindset in there, right there. But it's a hard thing to do, and I can explain that. But that 0.5% of rare earths and 99.5% of waste. But when it comes to iPhone, you have equivalent to 200 grams per ton of gold, which is basically 200 times of what the gold concentration is in a regular mine. You have your neodymium, praseodymium in there. You have your copper there. You have your silver there. You have your other metals in there, titanium there. So basically, in reality, recycling of an iPhone, if you just look into the rare earth elements, probably might not be economic. But at the same time, if you look into the whole picture, definitely there is quite a bit of value to capture. But going back to the very first part where we started this conversation, I think mining, and I come with a mining background, and it maybe doesn't look good when I say this, but mining is still around, and it's going to stay around because we need the mines. If we are going to meet all the targets for the electrification of our society that we have set by 2050, the very incredible goals that many of the countries have put forward, basically the amount of metals and material that we will need to consume to get there is much larger than the amount of material that we can recycle at the moment or in the next 10-15 years. Simply put, if you go back to early 2000s, 2002 to 2009, 2008, basically in one country, in China, every year, the life quality of 30 to 40 million people was changing from developing to developed country life qualities. And that basically means every year in China, one Canada was being born. And that means they are consuming material and metals. And that is still going on in the world, in Southeast Asia, many other jurisdictions. And with the consumption, and now in many countries, electrification of society, we just simply need a lot of metals that we can't really catch up with that by recycling in the next 20 years or so. So mining is still here to stay, and making it sustainable is the question, not getting rid of mining and just relying on recycling of materials. I don't think just recycling, at least in the next 30 years, is going to be the answer. My 2 cents.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, thank you, Ahmed. I think clearly there is this conundrum in terms of durability versus the recycling stock being available. And that's where mining is going to be very important for the foreseeable future. There may be some equilibrium in the very long term, which we reach, where the feedstock of products is going to be enough to provide complete circularity, but we're far from that right now. So we've got a couple of questions in the audience as well. One is about the Pacific Islands, if there's e-waste examples for island states And I can mention I have spent a lot of time in the Pacific Islands, and clearly, there can be opportunities for much better local level circularity, but I don't think there's systems specifically designed on that. We have developed an island policy lab actually at our university, at the University of Delaware. So colleagues there who are interested should visit our island policy lab page. And then there's the second question about profitability. Anyone would like to comment on that? Maybe Sharissa, you might want to comment on profitability side from your experience.
Yeah, so profitability and kind of any of these programs, it goes hand in hand with the volume that you receive back. So oftentimes when I was in the recycling innovation space at Apple, I was asked, what is the biggest challenge? And I didn't actually think it was technical. It was participation from customers. And so these projects only really make sense at high volume, right? It's like if you design a robotic system and you only get about 10,000 units back, that's not going to be profitable. This becomes profitable at scale. And I think that's what Ahmad was saying as well, right? Where it's like, we're not getting a lot of these electronics back today. And so, iPhones being kind of lucky, I think, Apple has like a very specific marketing brand. There's a very specific customer experience around it. And so I do think their engagement is quite a bit higher, but it's still probably not as great as it could be. And so at the end of the day, I do think that recycling technologies or recycling infrastructure are really driven by participation. And that's what makes the profits work. That's what makes this pencil out, is having enough material to actually utilize these technologies at their maximum utilization.
Indeed, yes. Upscaling and finding those economies of scale, that will take time. And do you see a role for government in that regard? What are people's views in terms of initial government subsidies to jumpstart that kind of effort? Hugo?
Yeah, we've been really impressed with the Canadian government in its forward thinking on making incentives for folks to do R&D. Jetty has benefited from 3 Canadian grant funding, either direct grants or through tax rebates, and that's the kind of thing that gets people innovating. I mean, we've got a team of I think 8 to 10 now at University of British Columbia doing joint research with them and coming up with new ideas. And I think that's the kind of sensible government intervention, is give companies incentives, folks like Ahmed and ourselves, to go and find technologies to improve circularity. I think putting regulations around it, I think is one way, but it's probably going to be quite unpopular. And will cause inflation if that's the case, because ultimately economics are going to be driving this.
Okay. What about the other side of regulation, environmental regulations? Sharissa, as someone who worked in industry, are they a hindrance to the circular economy? Because I often hear this, that, classification as hazardous waste, heavy metal classification, that in itself is a hindrance.
Yeah, I think that regulation often is well-intended, but sometimes doesn't have the desired output. I think, especially trying to write broad regulation at scale makes it really challenging. So an example of that for e-waste, and I'll tie that actually into the question that we received from Samoa on the South Pacific Islands opportunities for e-waste. You can't really ship e-waste across country borders. It was, written well-intended for, I'm sure everyone has seen images of electronic waste ending up in Asia, children trying to, recover materials from it. That's obviously not an ideal scenario, but if we're talking about a place like the South Pacific, it doesn't make sense to, deploy a DAISY or a LIAM over there, right? What we should be able to do is to collect that material and send it to a place where, we have the opportunity to recover the materials, whether it's high volume shredding or something else. But I do think that, e-waste regulation I've seen in my career be well-intended, but prevent innovation. So, not being able to consolidate iPhones to individual DAISY or LIAM systems because we can't cross e-waste across country borders. And then Ahmad probably knows this example better than I do, but there was a rare earth mine, unfortunately situated in California, Mountain Pass, very close to Nevada, which I believe if it had been in Nevada, it probably would still be viable. It might have been purchased by someone else, but at the time when I visited, they had a really hard time meeting the California specific regulations, which again, super well intended. I'm not saying California should, go back on the environmental regulations that they have, but it really prevented this company's ability to make product. And, their rare earth mine, again, my understanding at the time was actually much better than a lot of the things that you're seeing come out of China. So I think that regulation is important. I think, what Hugo was saying, it can really drive innovation in R&D when done correctly. But I think we also need to be really scrupulous on understanding what the actual real life effects are of regulation in practice. And I think movement of e-waste across borders is one of those.
Okay, great. Christian, just to wrap things up, we have about 4 minutes or so. Could you provide us your perspective as, the head of innovation at ICMM? Like, what are some of the next cutting edge areas that you see industry working on with reference to the circular economy? We haven't talked about this, but I often hear about phytomining, biomining. I've heard about in Canada, they're trying to extract selenium with microbes. What are some of cutting edge areas that you're seeing from your perspective at ICMM?
We have just published, ICMM has just published the Tails Innovation Roadmap. And if you look at the different technologies that you find there, they're from the pretty basic stuff of making the current mining more efficient to the ones that you are talking about, using microbes and leaching and so on. I think the biggest opportunity links to the models that you were describing, Saleem, at the beginning. So when you talk about resource solutions provider, a resource solutions provider looks very different to a mining company. I mean, it's not a mining company. A resource solutions provider has services, right? I mean, if you take it, for example, a met coal supplier today could be doing everything that is linked to CO2 utilization, CO2 reduction, CO2 carbon capture, everything that is CO2 trading, CO2 analytics, anything that has to do with the fact of the current product. They could be increasing the quality of their met coal. But it's almost like you have a portfolio of options that outperform your current model of only extracting the mineral in a linear way, and you're providing a service. That's why it's a solutions provider that helps your customers and potentially more customers in the value chain to extract value. And so I think we need to really recognize that if we keep equating recycling to the circular economy, we will dramatically fail. Dramatically fail. Because in any proper circular economy analysis, recycling is small and comes late. Very small and comes late. Recycling is almost the end bit of the linear economy. You produce waste and then you recover. We really need to step back and think about what is the system that we want to have in place to get to another paradigm. A mine is not a mine, it's the use of a land. And the moment you design the extraction of those minerals is to increase the productivity of the land so that you can use it for much longer periods of time in many other activities. And the product is the same. The product goes into the economy. You don't have to wait 40 years to recover it. You design a product to recover at any time, given the value of the material. And in that way, you have two different systems. And the circular economy is two circles at least. In the future, what you can see is a number of stocks, recovered and virgin, that are basically taking a balance. And those stocks are actually many circles. And it depends on the characteristics of the products that the market is consuming. And that is if we design for proper recovery. And so we really need to step back and think about what is the system that we want and design for that system.
If I could just
Hugo, yes, please.
Just one pickup that I've had is the big mining companies are, I would say, in the last 3 years have really started to focus on innovation, and they've built big technology teams and they're spending a lot of money in this area. They're looking at everything from automation to improved resource maximization, better use of water, carbon emission reductions. And it's really good to see, companies like BHP, Anglo are at the forefront of this, and it's very exciting. There's a lot of money coming into it, and I think it's going to be great over the next 5-10 years. In terms of discovery.
Well, on that optimistic note, I'd like to thank the organizers and the panel, the audience. We hope we'll get further inquiries later also. This will be recorded and put online. And in honor of the LIAMforum and Brock University, thank you very much indeed.